Empires rise, nations fall, power endures. Every superpower since Rome, ranked through intensive research and meta-analysis. A mathematically rigorous, politically neutral global military superpower index 117 AD to 2050. This is the result, scrolled backward from 2050 to 117 AD. 23 pivotal epochs across 1900 years of human history. For each, 5 independent expert assessments were compiled, then weighed against population, economic output, fiscal capacity, naval reach, and combat power. Reconciled into a single consensus score from 0 to 100. What you see scrolling past is the long arc of military power, the contested multipolarity of today, the unipolar American moment, 2 world wars, the British century, the Iberian peak, the Mongol singularity, all the way back to Trajan's Rome and Han China. 23 snapshots. The world's most powerful state at each one, and the rivals jockeying just below. Ending for now, with the 2050 projection flashing in front of you, the new top 3. The United States, still first. China, almost level. India, the breakout. The story is not finished. It never is. Empires rise. Nations fall. Power endures. 117 AD. 2 superpowers stretch across Eurasia, and they have never met. At 100, Trajan's Rome reaches its greatest extent. 55 million subjects, 28 legions, the most professional army in the world. At 92, the Eastern Han. 60 million people, paper just invented, the world's first civil service bureaucracy. At 62, Parthia, the only power strong enough to keep them apart. The Kushan at 48, controlling the Silk Road. The Satavahana at 37, India's south. Together, Rome and Han hold roughly half of humanity. 2 empires, 1 world, no contact. Year 800, the 3-empire world. At 100, the Abbasid Caliphate. Baghdad is a planned city of 1 million people, the largest on earth. Aristotle is being translated into Arabic. At 94, Tang, China. Chang'an, the only other million-person city, terminus of the Silk Road. At 73, the Carolingian Empire. On Christmas Day, Charlemagne is crowned emperor in Rome by Pope Leo. Western Europe, after 3 centuries of silence, quietly enters the conversation. At 65, the Byzantines, holding Constantinople and a long memory of Rome. At 49, the Tibetan Empire, dominating the high plateau, raiding both Tang and Abbasid frontiers. At 42, the Uyghur Khaganate, controlling the steppe. At 36, the Pala dynasty, patronizing Buddhism in Bengal. 3 civilizations, 3 scripts, 3 theologies. The medieval world begins. 1206, the eve of the storm. At 100, the Jurchen Jin dynasty rules northern China. 50 million subjects, paper money, the largest cavalry force in the world. At 81, the Khwarezmian Empire, dominating Central Asia from the Caspian to the Indus. At 80, the Southern Song, the world's wealthiest maritime empire. Gunpowder weapons, paper currency, foundries unmatched for 600 years. Then, the new entrant. At 73, the Mongols. On the steppe this year, an unknown chieftain named Temujin is proclaimed Genghis Khan over a confederation of 2 million people. Within 20 years, all of this above him will be his. At 59, the Ayyubid Sultanate, Saladin's heirs in Cairo and Damascus. At 46, the Delhi Sultanate. At 33, the Byzantine successor states, scattered after the Crusader sack 2 years ago. 1250, the Mongol peak. At 100, the largest contiguous land empire in history. Korea to Hungary under one Khan, 100 million subjects under a single tax code. Mongol post stations carry messages 5,000 miles in days, a speed the world won't match for 600 years. Pax Mongolica, is real. At 66, the Mamluks of Egypt, slave soldiers turned ruling caste. 10 years from now, they will halt the Mongol advance at Ain Jalut, the only force in this century to do so. At 60, the Southern Song, holding the Yangtze line for 30 more years. At 48, the Delhi Sultanate, wealthy and fortified. In Europe, the powers are small. France at 35 under St. Louis, the Holy Roman Empire fragmenting at 33. England at 30. Power briefly has a single capital, and it is Karakoram. That will not happen again. 1450, the eve of European expansion. At 100, the Ming Dynasty, the richest place on earth, 120 million people, gunpowder armies, treasure ships 10 times anything in Europe. At 83, the Ottomans under Mehmed II. In 3 years, they will take Constantinople with cannon Europeans cannot yet build. The medieval Roman Empire ends. At 54, the Timurid Empire, Samarkand in its golden age, Ulugh Beg's observatory, the most advanced in the world. At 52, Vijayanagara, the great Hindu kingdom of South India. At 50, the Mamluks, controlling the Egypt Red Sea spice route Europeans resent paying for. At 48, France, just emerging from the 100 Years' War. At 44, Poland-Lithuania, the largest state in Christendom. Across the Atlantic, unknown to all of them, the Inca at 42 reaching their peak under Pachacuti, the Aztec at 39, and Songhai at 33 rising along the Niger. Europe is a backwater. Within 50 years, that reverses completely. 1500, the world becomes one. At 100, Ming China still leads. But Beijing has burned its ocean-going fleet and turned inward, just as Europe is putting to sea. At 88, the Ottomans, now a Mediterranean power. Selim I will soon take Egypt, and the Caliphate moves to Istanbul. At 68, Spain. Granada has fallen 8 years ago, ending 8 centuries of Reconquista. Columbus has landed. At 57, Portugal. Vasco da Gama has just reached India by sea, breaking a Mediterranean monopoly 2,000 years old. In 1494, Spain and Portugal divided the entire planet on a map at Tordesillas. They drew a line down the Atlantic. They actually expected the world to honor it. At 57, France. At 51, Vijayanagara. At 48, the Mamluks, about to be conquered. At 45, Poland-Lithuania. At 45, Safavid Persia, just founded by Shah Ismail this very year. In the Americas, the Aztec at 34 are 15 years from Cortez. Globalization in the literal sense begins now. 1550, the Ottoman military zenith. At 100, the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent. Janissaries with matchlocks, the largest siege artillery in the world, a fleet that will reach Aden, Aceh, and the gates of Vienna. Suleiman has taken Belgrade, Rhodes, and Buda. At 89, Ming China, at peace and prospering, importing 150 tons of silver a year from across the Pacific. At 84, the Spanish Habsburg monarchy under Charles V. Spain, the Netherlands, Naples, the Americas, and the Holy Roman Empire under one man. At 61, Safavid Persia under Shah Tahmasp. At 58, the early Mughal Empire under the young Akbar. At 55, Portugal, master of the Indian Ocean spice route. At 52, France, under Henri II, the age of gunpowder empires has begun. 1600, the Iberian Peak. At 100, Spain and Portugal united, under Philip II since 1580. A single empire from the Philippines to Peru to Goa. Silver from Potosi floods the world economy and fuels Ming inflation halfway around the world. The first truly global power. At 90, the Mughal Empire under Akbar. quarter of world GDP. Population larger than all of Europe combined. At 90, the Ottoman Empire, beginning to plateau. At 83, the Ming, late period, struggling with silver dependence. At 76, the Dutch Republic, 2 million people, 60 armed merchant ships. The world's first stock exchange opens in Amsterdam 2 years from now. At 73, France, recovering from religious wars under Henry IV. At 66, Safavid Persia under Shah Abbas. At 59, Poland-Lithuania. At 59, England. At 55, Tokugawa Japan, just unified at Sekigahara this October. The Iberian Peak ends here. The next century belongs to the Dutch and the French. 1650, the Dutch Golden Age. At 100, France under the young Louis XIV, just 12 years old. Mazarin is regent. The Fronde Rebellion is in full swing. France is the largest, richest country in Europe. At 99, the Dutch Republic, almost tied. 2 million people running the world's economy. Amsterdam invents modern finance, joint stock companies, central banking, futures markets. Rembrandt is at his peak. New Amsterdam is a Dutch town. At 94, the Mughal Empire under Shah Jahan. The Taj Mahal was finished 6 years ago. Quarter of world GDP. At 90, the new Qing Empire. The Manchus took Beijing 6 years ago. At 78, the Ottoman Empire, post-Suleiman, still formidable. At 73, Sweden under Christina, a great power for 50 years against all demographic logic. At 69, England under Cromwell, the regicide just 1 year past. The Commonwealth briefly is a republic. At 64, Spain, visibly fading. Once supreme, now bankrupt. The military revolution has crossed the channel. War is now a science. 1700, the Sun King at zenith. At 100, France, 20 million people. Versailles defines European court culture. Louis XIV fields 400,000 men, the largest standing army on the continent. French is the diplomatic language of Europe, and will be for 2 centuries. At 93, the Qing under the Kangxi Emperor. China's last great age of expansion. Mongolia is being absorbed. Tibet next. At 75, the Mughal Empire under Aurangzeb. Vast but fraying. The Marathas have already taken the Deccan. At 69, England, post-Glorious Revolution. Constitutional monarchy, Bank of England 8 years old. At 64, the Ottomans, defeated at Vienna 17 years ago. The long retreat begins. At 62, Habsburg Austria. At 60, Sweden. At 57, Spain. At 52, Russia under Peter the Great, rebuilding everything. Louis's wars are bankrupting him. A coalition is forming to bring him down. 1763. The Treaty of Paris is signed in February. Britain wins everything. At 100, the United Kingdom. Canada, Florida, India, all British. France is ejected from North America. The Royal Navy now patrols every ocean. Quebec, Plassey, Manila, Havana, all taken in 7 years. The British century begins now, and it will last 150. At 76, France. Defeated, indebted, but still the second power in Europe. The Enlightenment is French. At 75, the Qing Empire. Qianlong is on the throne. China is at its largest territorial extent in 2,000 years. At 73, Russia under Catherine the Great, just enthroned a year ago. The conquest of Crimea and the partitions of Poland are coming. At 70, Prussia. Frederick the Great has just survived 7 years against Russia, France, and Austria simultaneously. Prussia is now permanently a great power. At 59, Spain, forced to cede Florida. At 58, Austria, defeated but enormous. At 44, the Ottomans, weakening visibly. At 41, the Maratha Confederacy, the real Indian power. At 35, the Dutch, no longer a great power. The world is now decided in London. 1790. The world before revolutions. At 100, the United Kingdom. The Industrial Revolution is igniting in Manchester and Birmingham. Cotton mills, coke iron, James Watt's engines. Per capita output is pulling away from every other country. At 87, France. 28 million people. The Bastille fell 10 months ago. The monarchy is in its last years. At 78, Russia under Catherine, just finishing the Russo-Turkish War with Crimea annexed. At 73, the Qing Empire, ruling a third of the world's population. The empire looks indestructible. It is 45 years from the Opium War. At 63, Habsburg Austria. At 60, Spain. The empire still spans California to Patagonia. Within 25 years, almost all of it will be lost. At 58, Prussia. At 47, the Ottomans, retreating in every direction. At 44, the Marathas. At 31, Mysore under Tipu Sultan, fighting the British East India Company with rocket artillery. The United States is 1 year old with no army to speak of. It does not appear on this list. (1815), the Congress of Vienna. At 100, the United Kingdom. Napoleon defeated at Waterloo in June. Britain ends the long French wars as banker, naval power, and industrial leader of the world. The pound sterling becomes the global reserve. The Royal Navy will not face a peer fleet for 99 years. At 87, Russia. Tsar Alexander rode into Paris last year. Russia holds the largest army on the continent and the moral authority of having broken Napoleon. The gendarme of Europe. At 67, Prussia, reformed under Stein, victorious at Leipzig and Waterloo. At 63, Austria, restored under Metternich, who will run European politics for 33 years. At 60, France, defeated, occupied, but kept whole. The Bourbons restored, Napoleon to St. Helena. At 53, the Qing, decline accelerating, though the West won't notice for 20 more years. At 42, the Ottomans. At 36, Spain. The American empire is shattering. Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, breaking free. At 35, the United States, growing fast. At 23, the Maratha Confederacy, defeated by the East India Company 2 years ago. India is now British. The Pax Britannica begins. 1871, the dawn of industrial warfare. In January, the German Empire is proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, on the ruins of France. Bismarck has unified Germany in 7 years across 3 short wars. At 100, the United Kingdom. Still first, by colonies, by trade, by capital, by ships. At 96, the new German Empire. A new style of war defines the industrial age. General staff, rail mobilization, breech-loading rifles, Krupp steel artillery. Germany is now the gold standard for land warfare. Every other army in Europe will spend 40 years copying it. At 69, France. Defeated, paying 5 billion gold francs in indemnities. Alsace and Lorraine annexed. The Third Republic is 6 months old. At 68, Russia. Freed of serfdom 10 years ago, slowly industrializing. At 56, Austria-Hungary, restructured into a dual monarchy. At 55, the United States. The Civil War ended 6 years ago. Industrial output now exceeds Britain's. At 38, the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe. At 37, Italy, just unified. At 30, Japan. The Meiji Restoration is 3 years old. Industrial modernization begins immediately. Britain rules the seas. On land, Germany is now first. 1905. the Royal Navy's high noon. At 100, the United Kingdom. The Empire covers a quarter of the planet. The Dreadnought launches next year, instantly making every other battleship obsolete, including Britain's own. The Royal Navy commands every ocean from Halifax to Hong Kong. At 92, the German Empire. The Kaiser is building a fleet to rival Britain's. The naval arms race is on. Germany leads the world in chemistry, optics, and electrical engineering. At 74, Japan, the surprise. In May, Admiral Togo annihilates the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima. 2/3 of the Russian Navy on the bottom in one afternoon. The first non-Western victory over a European power in modern history. At 71, France, allied with Russia since 1894, with Britain since the Entente Cordiale last year. At 62, Russia, humiliated by Japan, in revolution at home. The Romanovs have 12 years left. At 61, the United States. Theodore Roosevelt is in his second term. America has just won the Spanish-American War, taking the Philippines. At 55, Austria-Hungary. At 41, Italy. At 35, the Ottomans, a decade from total collapse. The first non-Western great power is on the board. The colonial certainty is cracking. 1914, the most multipolar moment in modern history. At 100, the United Kingdom, empire at peak. A quarter of the globe, a fifth of humanity, the world's reserve currency. At 98, the German Empire, almost tied. Largest population in Europe west of Russia. Industrial output above Britain. Krupp Steel, BASF Chemistry, the world's best universities. At 81, France, militarily formidable, demographically stagnant. At 69, Russia, vast, modernizing, the great unknown. At 69, the United States, already the largest economy in the world. The army is small, the latent power is enormous. At 62, Japan, allied with Britain. At 59, Austria-Hungary, the multi-ethnic empire that holds the trigger. At 46, Italy, neutral at the start. At 38, the Ottoman Empire, 6 centuries old, in its last years. A Serbian student shoots an Austrian archduke in Sarajevo on June 28. By August, alliances pull every major power into a continental war no one wanted. By 1918, 4 of these empires will be gone: Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans. A century of European primacy ends here. (1939) Blitzkrieg unleashed. At 100, Nazi Germany. 6 years of rearmament. 103 divisions. 3,000 tanks. 4,000 aircraft. Germany has pioneered a new way of war. Armor, motorized infantry, and tactical air integrated by radio into a single doctrine. Poland will fall in 5 weeks. At 84, the United Kingdom. Largest empire in history but stretched thin. Chamberlain at Munich a year ago. Conscription this spring. The fleet is ready. The army is not. At 83, the Soviet Union. Stalin's purges have gutted the officer corps. He has shot more of his own generals in 3 years than the Wehrmacht will kill in 4. The Hitler-Stalin Pact was signed in August. At 77, Japan. 2 years into total war with China. 2 million men under arms. At 74, France. On paper, the largest army in Europe. More tanks than Germany. The doctrine is wrong. May 1940 will prove it in 6 weeks. At 69, the United States. Ranking 17th in the world by army size. Industrial capacity unmatched anywhere. At 46, Italy under Mussolini. At 36, Poland. Invaded September 1st. Erased within a month. The deadliest 6 years in human history begin now. 1945, the American moment. At 100, the United States. Half the world's economy. half its industrial output, sole atomic power, a bi-ocean navy with no rival in either ocean, more aircraft carriers than the rest of the world combined, cities intact, factories running, treasury overflowing. No country has held this much relative power, before or since. At 87, the Soviet Union, 8 million dead in arms, 20 million civilians. The Red Army holds Berlin, Warsaw, Prague, half of Korea. The Eastern Empire begins. At 57, the United Kingdom, victorious, bankrupt. India will be independent in 2 years. The empire enters its long retreat. At 34, France, restored. De Gaulle in Paris. At 31, China. Civil war between Mao and Chiang resumes the moment the Japanese leave. The bipolar world begins now. (1985) Peak Cold War. At 100, the United States. Reagan in his second term. The Strategic Defense Initiative is announced. Defense spending at 6% of GDP. 11 aircraft carriers. At 95, the Soviet Union. Almost tied. Mikhail Gorbachev becomes General Secretary in March. Glasnost and Perestroika are coming. The Soviet system has 6 years left, and almost no one knows it. 2 superpowers, the rest a clear tier below. 50,000 nuclear warheads pointed in 2 directions. At 65, the United Kingdom under Thatcher. Falklands 3 years ago. North Sea oil. At 63, France under Mitterrand. Force de frappe. At 54, West Germany. Wirtschaftswunder mature. At 47, China. Deng Xiaoping 7 years into reform and opening. GDP per capita still under $300. At 46, Japan. The asset bubble is forming. Toyota and Sony define quality. At 36, India. License Raj still in force. The Berlin Wall stands. The world feels permanent. It is not. 1991. The unipolar moment begins. At 100, the United States. The Gulf War in January and February showcases American precision warfare. Stealth aircraft, satellite navigation, laser-guided bombs, total air superiority. Iraq's army, the 4th largest in the world, collapses in 100 hours. American casualties, 148 killed. The Soviet Union dissolves on Christmas Day. 15 successor states. The Red Army, world's largest, is now 13 separate armies. At 67, Russia. Hyperinflation, oligarchs, free fall. At 67, the United Kingdom. At 65, France. Maastricht Treaty negotiated this December. At 52, China. Watching Iraq closely, quietly resolving never to fight America that way. 2 decades of double-digit growth begin. At 48, Japan. The bubble has burst last year. The lost decades start. At 45, reunified Germany. Capital moves to Berlin. At 40, India. A balance of payments crisis forces the liberalization that ends the license Raj. The end of history, they said. It lasted 25 years. 2000. The unipolar moment at its apex. At 100, the United States. Defense budget bigger than the next 7 nations combined. 11 supercarriers when no one else has more than 1. Tomahawks, GPS, stealth. At 77, the United Kingdom under Tony Blair. Cool Britannia. At 75, France under Chirac. At 62, China. Just admitted to the World Trade Organization. The bet of the decade. Manufacturing about to flood the world. At 56, Russia. Putin sworn in as president in May. Oil at $30 and rising. At 55, Japan. Year 10 of the lost decade. At 53, Germany. The euro in circulation in 2 years. At 48, India. Liberalization paying off. The American century looks like it might be the next one too. September 11th is 11 months away. The unipolar moment is shorter than anyone realizes. Today, the contested multipolar order. At 100, the United States. 800 bases, a near $1 trillion budget, alliances with the next 5 most capable militaries on the planet. Still first, by integration and reach. At 89, China. The People's Liberation Army Navy is now the world's largest by hull count, surpassing the United States 2 years ago. 3 carriers. Hypersonic glide vehicles operational, the first peer competitor in 35 years. At 72, France. Force de frappe, 2 carriers planned, leading European defense after the Ukraine war. At 69, the United Kingdom. 2 new carriers in service, AUKUS, GCAP fighter program with Italy and Japan. At 68, Russia, brutally attrited in Ukraine. 500,000 casualties for a few hundred kilometers. The conventional reputation built on rumor has been broken. Nuclear arsenal intact. At 66, India. Largest population on Earth. Fastest growing major economy, Quad member. At 61, Japan. Defense spending doubling to 2% of GDP. Counterstrike capability. At 53, South Korea. World-class defense industry exporting to Poland, Australia, the Middle East. At 52, Germany. €100 billion Sondervermögen for Bundeswehr modernization. The defense holiday is over. At 51, Turkey. Bayraktar drones reshaping the battlefield. Every major power is rearming. The peace dividend is spent. 2050. Best guess. Wide error bars. At 100, the United States. Demographics still growing, immigration still working, the alliance system still standing. The longest naval primacy in history, second only to Britain's. American GDP per capita, twice China's even at projected convergence. At 99, China. The closest contest in the data. China's demographic peak is past. They lose 300 million people by century's end. Workforce already shrinking. But the Navy, the missile force, the industrial base, the rare earth monopoly are all here. Whether they cross 100 depends on Taiwan. At 85, India. The breakout. Population at 1.5 billion. Median age 28. A maturing defense industry. Indigenous aircraft carriers, indigenous fighter, growing space program. Defense budget compounding faster than China's. At 62, France. Population still growing, the only major European country with that property. At 59, the United Kingdom. Finally drops below 60, ending a 450-year run as a top 5 power. At 59, Japan. Demographic decline severe, but offset by capital and capability. At 57, Germany. Aging population, strong industry. At 56, Russia. Demographically wrecked, geographically vast, nuclear armed. Diminished, but dangerous. At 53, South Korea. Demographic cliff, worst in the world. Defense industry, world class. At 53, Turkey. Demographics, drones, and ambition. The error bars are wide. Wars not yet fought. Technologies not yet invented. Leaders not yet born. The story isn't finished. It never is.